Okay, so in the last lecture, we fleshed out this modular view of the mind, this idea that there's no chief executive in your brain, but rather there are a lot of modules that take turns exerting dominant influence on your thought and your behavior. And we saw that this view dovetails pretty nicely with this Buddhist idea of not self, the idea that there is no kind of solid self at your core that persists coherently through time and keeps things under control. So there is a pretty close correspondence between this particular model within modern psychology and this particular Buddhist doctrine. Okay, but what about Buddhist practice? What about meditation? Can the modular view of the mind illuminate meditation and help explain what's going on when people meditate, what's going on in their minds? Well, I do think there are some illuminating connections between the modular view of the mind and meditation. And in fact, in the last lecture, there was buried a kind of clue about the nature of that illumination. It was in something that Lita Cosmides said. You may remember she's a pioneer in evolutionary psychology and also in developing modular views of the mind. And she was talking about a jealous state of mind and describing it as a kind of a modular mechanism that coordinates various, thoughts and perceptions to a specific end. And she said something, and I want to flash back to it here, that may give you a clue about this connection between meditation and the modular view of the mind.
That is as taking over from the point of view of the state that we're usually in, where there's not a specific kind of coordination that's going on, but a lot of different mechanisms are bubbling up and down in terms of their activation.
Okay, so she talked about mechanisms bubbling up and down and different levels of activation. Now I'm hoping that as I repeat that phrase, you may be thinking of a phrase that we heard earlier in an earlier lecture. I'll pause now and give it a chance to spring to mind. The phrase is default mode network. The default mode network, as you may recall, is this thing that gets activated when the mind isn't engaged in anything in particular. It's not absorbed in any task. It's kind of just the mind wandering. And we also saw that the default mode network gets quieter during meditation. That's what brain scan studies have shown us. And if you've done much meditating at all, you probably know that sometimes the default mode network doesn't quiet down easily. You may sit down to meditate, try to focus on your breath, and suddenly you're thinking, oh, I hope I didn't offend that person yesterday when I said that thing, or oh, that was an attractive person I met the other day. I wonder if maybe he or she would go to dinner with me. I wonder where we could go, what kind of clever things I could say, what would happen after dinner. Now, as Lita's phrasing may suggest, somebody who has a modular view of the mind might be inclined to view the default mode network as just a bunch of modules kind of trying to get your attention. I mean, trying metaphorically, presumably they're not conscious, but they're kind of vying, competing for your attention. So when you think, I wonder if I offended that person yesterday, that would presumably be a module in the realm that Douglas Kenrick in the last lecture called the affiliative module. In other words, the larger module in charge of kind of making and keeping friendships and doing various other things and navigating the social landscape. And when you're thinking about having dinner with that attractive person and rehearsing what you might say, then that presumably is part of the mate attraction module. Now, I want to take this opportunity to qualify something that I said in the previous lecture. There we talked about modules being activated by information out there in the environment. You might be in the presence of someone attractive, and that activates your mate attraction module, for example. But as some of these examples suggest, for example, thinking, oh, did I offend that person? It isn't always the case that information right in your immediate real-time environment is what triggers a module. I mean, the information came into your system at some point from the environment, but apparently modules can kind of ruminate on information. The information works itself through the process before it actually gets presented to your consciousness in a particular form. Now, this quieting of the default mode network can happen with various kinds of meditation. It can happen with mindfulness meditation and with concentration meditation, as we discussed earlier. Concentration meditation is particularly effective at quieting the default mode network in the first instance, because if you're focused on something, that's a good way to kind of short circuit the default mode network, which after all is something that kind of perks up when you're not focused on anything. And for that reason, in mindfulness meditation, you often start with concentration meditation. But at some point in mindfulness meditation, once you've established kind of the concentration and the equilibrium, then you head off in a different path from the concentration meditator. And we've talked about that. And here you see a particular connection between meditation and modules, a kind of second connection between meditation and modules that applies specifically to mindfulness meditation. Because remember, mindfulness meditation, as we described it, consists of looking at things inside your mind and also things in the outside world in a kind of a new way with, you might say, more objectivity, less attachment, and carrying that view into everyday life, ideally, beyond, outside of the meditation hall. And one of the things that you may view in a new way that is of special consequence is your feelings. As we said, you view your feelings with less attachment, and they may not get the same kind of traction with you. They may not have the same kind of power to drag your mind in a particular direction. Well, the other thing we've learned about feelings very recently is that feelings are what trigger modules. So if you show people a scary movie, it seems to activate a self-protection module by making them feel fear. And if you show people a romantic movie, it seems to give them feelings that activate a different module and make them behave differently. And this is also true with some things we were calling submodules in the last lecture. For example, jealousy is a very strong feeling that triggers a kind of certain set of modular operations. Now, I would contend that actually there are always feelings kind of associated with modules, and that if when you start meditating and these modules are bidding for your attention, if you pay close attention, I think that you'll see that the way they bid for your attention is with feelings. So, for example, if you're suddenly thinking, did I offend that person the other day? Well, that's a kind of a negative feeling that gets your attention, and the way to make it go away, the natural way to make it go away, is to come up with a solution to the problem. So if you say, I know what I'll do, I'll send an email to that person, ostensibly about something else, but in the course of it, I'll refer to the conversation we had in a way that will make it clear what I intended and that I didn't intend any offense. And then the bad feeling goes away, the module has done its work, and you're now vulnerable to some other module, right? And similarly, if you're fantasizing about that dinner you're going to have with that attractive person, well, that's a good feeling for the most part, and it's a pleasant thing to think about, and that keeps you thinking about it. So I think that by and large, feelings are the things that give modules power over you. So you could view mindfulness, both mindfulness meditation and mindfulness as you carry it out into the world, as a way of kind of determining which modules do and don't get to be in control. By being mindful of the feelings that usher modules in, that trigger modules, you can influence which modules win and which modules lose. Now, is this a useful way of talking about mindfulness? I mean, after all, we've already said something kind of related. We've said earlier in the course that mindfulness does give you some control over feelings. You decide which feelings get traction, which don't. And we've said that feelings can change your perceptions. We saw that fear can make you think that something that's not a snake is in fact a snake. Does it do any good to kind of describe this in terms of modules rather than in terms of the feelings that trigger the modules? I think there is some value, because I think it drives home that when you're being mindful, you're influencing, whether an entire frame of mind sets in that influences thoughts and perceptions, and that can influence those thoughts and perceptions in really subtle ways and for a really long time. So a good example of this, I think, is hatred. Now, hatred, from the point of view of an evolutionary psychologist, is, among other things, a feeling that defines enemies, okay? If you hate someone, they're an enemy. You can be angry at someone who's a friend, but if you hate them, they're not your friend. And natural selection seems to have equipped the human mind to deal in particular ways with enemies and in particular ways with friends. And behavioral scientists have discovered one very interesting feature of the different ways that we look at enemies and friends, and it's this. When our friends do something good, we attribute it to their inner essence. This is just the kind of thing they do. They're good people, okay? If they do something bad, we attribute it to some external factor, some circumstance. We say, oh, well, it was just peer group pressure, or they hadn't had sleep in days, so they weren't really themselves. And by the way, you may recognize this as a way we think about our own behavior, right? When we do something good, that's us. And when we do something bad, there's some external explanation for it. Well, when we think about our enemies, it's actually the opposite, it turns out. When they do something bad, we attribute that to their essential nature. That's the way they are, they're bad. When they do something good, we explain it away in terms of something external. Well, they were just doing it to please so-and-so who happened to be there, or they were coerced into doing it, or whatever. Now, presumably, this feature exists in our mind, was designed by natural selection, presumably, to, among other things, encourage us to talk about enemies in this particular way. When we talk about enemies to other people, it's in our interest, in kind of strategic terms, to talk about them in very unflattering terms, because it's in our interest to undermine the stature of our enemies, who are people who can do us harm, and the more stature they have, the more harm they can do us. So this may be very much a propaganda tool, but it does seem to be the case that in order to spread the propaganda more effectively, we actually believe this. We actually believe that our enemies are these people who do bad things by nature and good things for other reasons. And one reason this can be really important is because when a nation is deciding whether or not to go to war, it really matters how the people in the other country and the leader of the country are framed. And this helps explain why people who are trying to encourage you to go to war will tend to frame the leader in the country they want to invade as evil as possible. So the Iraq War in 2003 was a good example. People who supported the war in America, some of them at least, not all of them, compared Saddam Hussein to Hitler, who of course is as evil as it gets. And if you're going to try to really firmly entrench hatred in someone's mind, that's a good comparison to make. And once you've framed the leader of the nation you hope to invade as an enemy, once you've got that frame firmly set, it's very hard for him to get out of it. Because if he does anything good or anything accommodating, it'll be attributed to external circumstances, but whenever he does anything bad, it'll be taken as more evidence of how bad he is. Now, hatred is a very strong emotion. You know it when you feel it. It's very dramatic. But I do think that the kind of frame that it creates, the enemy frame, can be sustained with subtler feelings of antipathy. It's not like every time you think of your enemy, you fly into a rage. No, it can be a lot subtler than that, and that's one reason mindfulness meditation can be valuable, and a mindful attitude can be valuable, because you pick up on feelings that are sufficiently subtle that you might otherwise miss them. So I guess I'd say that in sum, the case for viewing mindfulness meditation in the context of this modular view of the mind is, first of all, it drives home that there's a whole frame kind of being installed in your mind, and you can influence which frame it is through mindfulness, and that this frame can influence your perceptions very subtly. It's a lot subtler than seeing a snake that's not there. And the feelings that sustain the frame can be pretty subtle, and in fact, you may become aware of them only if you are carrying a mindful attitude into the world. Now, in a way, this brings us back to the not-self doctrine. We saw earlier that the Buddha's kind of famous discourse on the not-self is amenable to differing interpretations. There's the full-bodied interpretation that he was emphatically denying the very existence of the self. We saw that there's also a kind of minority interpretation that views his aims as somewhat less ambitious. And there the idea is that one way you could look at that discourse is as saying, there's no part of your mind that has to be part of yourself. There's no feeling you have to own. There's no thought you have to own, and you can choose which things to let go of. Well, to translate that into modular terms, you might say that the idea is, there's no module you have to own, or there's no module you have to be. Because remember, modules are these things that are in some sense kind of trying to become the self for a while, right? And that's one reason that Douglas Kenrick in the previous lecture was referring to them as sub-selves. So, as for the deeper notion of not self, the idea that the self really does not exist, there are people who have meditative experiences that convince them of the truth of this doctrine. They say they have seen the absence of a self kind of in themselves. I guess I should put that last selves in quotes maybe, but they experientially come to know the doctrine of not self. Now, near the end of this lecture, we're going to look at whether the modular view of the mind helps make sense of what's going on in the minds of these people as they have these experiences. And we're going to look at some of the kinds of reports you get from these people. But first, we're going to take a little detour. And I think it's going to be a detour that helps us answer this question about what's going on in the minds of these people, or at least helps us frame it a little more firmly. And what we're going to do, and this is in the next segment of this lecture, is we're going to look at the issue of self-control, of controlling our appetites. And we're going to ask, how does self-control happen if, in fact, there is no self?